When I returned from a 3-week hospital stay after my devastating car accident, I found my house completely empty. My mother-in-law, Patricia, stood in my living room with a smug smile, holding a stack of receipts. "I sold everything to pay your medical bills," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Someone had to be practical while you were indisposed." She gestured around my bare living room like she'd done me the greatest favor in the world. What Patricia didn't know was that 3 years earlier, I had quietly purchased the mortgage on her $400,000 dream home in Lake Oswego through my investment portfolio. And according to my records, her payment was already 2 months late. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes it serves justice on a silver platter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Miller, and up until 3 weeks ago, my life was exactly where I wanted it to be. At 32, I had built a successful career as a financial advisor here in Portland, Oregon, helping middle-class families plan for their futures and make smart investment decisions. My office sits in a converted Victorian house in the Pearl district, where I've spent the last 7 years building a client base that trusts me with their most important financial decisions. I live in a charming 2-bedroom Craftsman house in the Hawthorne neighborhood that I inherited from my grandmother, Eleanor. The house isn't large by today's standards, but it's filled with character, original hardwood floors that creak in the right places, built-in bookshelves in the living room that stretch from floor to ceiling, and a kitchen with vintage white subway tiles that catch the morning light just perfectly. My grandmother had impeccable taste, and every piece of furniture, every decoration, every carefully chosen item in that house told a story of her life, and by extension, mine. For 5 years, I've shared this space with my husband, Mike, a gentle, hardworking man who supervises construction crews for a local building company. Mike stands 6 feet tall with calloused hands that speak to honest work, and brown eyes that light up when he talks about the houses his team builds. He's the kind of man who brings me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings and still opens car doors. For me, after all these years of marriage. Or at least, he was. Recent events have made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I married. Mike comes from a family that's complicated. His father left when Mike was 12, and his mother, Patricia, remarried Robert Thompson when Mike was 16. Patricia Thompson is what you might call a force of nature, though not necessarily in a good way. At 58, she carries herself like someone who's never been told no and doesn't plan to start hearing it now. She lives in an upscale neighborhood, in Lake Oswego, in a house that screams new money with its marble countertops, vaulted ceilings, and meticulously maintained landscaping. From the moment Mike introduced me to his family, Patricia made it clear that I wasn't what she had in mind for her son. During our first dinner together, she'd asked pointed questions about my background, my education, my family's financial status. When she learned that I was a first-generation college graduate whose grandparents had been blue-collar workers, she'd smiled that tight smile that never reached her eyes and said, "How refreshing." The word dripped with condescension. Over the years, Patricia had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. She'd comment on my quaint little house with its vintage charm, always emphasizing that Mike could have afforded something much nicer if he'd pursued a different career. She'd critique my clothing choices, suggesting that as Mike's wife, I should dress more professionally since I represented him now. She'd offer to take me shopping for appropriate outfits, which was her way of saying everything in my closet was inadequate. Robert, Patricia's second husband, is a quiet man who made his money in tech before retiring early. He's pleasant enough in small doses, but he's clearly learned that keeping the peace means agreeing with whatever Patricia says. Their house is Patricia's domain, decorated entirely to her taste with expensive furniture that looks like it belongs in a magazine rather than a home where people actually live. Despite Patricia's disapproval, Mike and I had built a good life together. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our plans for the future. Every morning, I'd wake up in our bedroom that overlooks the small garden where my grandmother had planted rose bushes that still bloom every spring. I'd make coffee in the kitchen using the same coffee maker my grandmother had used, sitting at the breakfast nook where she'd read her morning paper for 40 years. My house was more than just a place to live. It was a repository of memories and family history. My grandmother's china cabinet held dishes that had been wedding gifts in 1952. The living room bookshelf contained first edition novels that my grandmother had collected over her lifetime, many of them signed by authors she'd met at literary events in downtown Portland. In my bedroom dresser, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was my grandmother's jewelry collection, pieces she'd acquired over decades of marriage, including her wedding ring that she'd specifically left to me. Every item in that house had been chosen with intention and care. The coffee table in the living room was an antique cherrywood piece that my grandmother had refinished herself, spending weekends in the garage with sandpaper and stain until it gleamed. The dining room set had been a splurge purchase from an estate sale, solid walnut with intricate carved details that my grandmother had admired for years before finally buying it. Even the clothes in my closet were carefully curated, professional, blazers for work, casual pieces for weekends, and a few special occasion dresses that I'd invested in over the years. I took pride in my home and my possessions, not because I was materialistic, but because they represented the life I'd built and the legacy my grandmother had left me. Unlike Patricia, who seemed to acquire things for their status value, every item in my house had meaning beyond its price tag. 3 weeks ago, all of that changed in the space of a few devastating seconds. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was driving home from a client meeting in Beaverton. The autumn rain had been coming down steadily all day, making the roads slick and visibility poor. I'd had a good meeting with a young couple who were buying their first home, helping them understand the mortgage process and plan for their financial future. I remember feeling satisfied with my work as I navigated the familiar streets toward home, looking forward to telling Mike about how excited the couple had been when I'd shown them how much they could save by putting a little extra toward their principal each month. I was stopped at a red light at the intersection of Powell and 39th, just a few blocks from my house, when I saw headlights approaching fast in my rearview mirror. Too fast. The drunk driver behind me never even touched his brakes. The impact sent my compact car spinning across the intersection and into a light pole. The screech of metal and breaking glass, the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit at OHSU Hospital. The doctors told me later that I'd suffered a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and my left arm had been shattered so badly that it required multiple surgeries to reconstruct. For the first week, I drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the tubes and machines that were keeping me alive. Mike was there when I finally came fully awake. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, his construction uniform wrinkled and his usually neat hair disheveled. His relief when I opened my eyes and spoke his name was so profound that he started crying right there in the hospital room. "I thought I was going to lose you," he kept saying, holding my good hand like he was afraid I might disappear. The doctors explained that I'd been lucky to survive the impact, but that my recovery would be long and difficult. The arm surgeries alone would require at least 2 more weeks in the hospital, followed by months of physical therapy. The head injury meant I needed to be monitored carefully for any signs of complications. There was no question that I'd be in the hospital for at least 3 weeks, possibly longer. For the first week, Mike barely left my side. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He slept in the uncomfortable chair next to my bed, ate hospital food from the cafeteria, and held my hand through every painful procedure and sleepless night. He brought me books to read when I was ready for them, and fresh flowers that made my sterile room feel a little more human. His devotion during those first dark days reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. But as the second week began, the reality of the situation started to set in. Mike had been taking time off work, but he couldn't stay away indefinitely. His construction crew was in the middle of a big project, and his boss was getting impatient. The medical bills were starting to pile up, even with insurance, and Mike was stressed about managing everything on his own. That's when Patricia stepped in with her offer to help. "Let me take care of the house while you focus on work and visiting Jessica," she told Mike during one of her daily visits to the hospital. She'd bring elaborate flower arrangements and expensive chocolates, making a show of how concerned she was about my recovery. "I can check on things, make sure everything's secure, maybe even start organizing for when Jessica comes home. You know how overwhelming it can be to return to a house that's been sitting empty." I should have said no immediately. Every instinct. I had screamed that giving Patricia access to my house was a terrible idea. But I was exhausted, in pain, and worried about the strain Mike was under trying to manage everything. When Patricia suggested that she could just keep an eye on things, it seemed like the practical solution. "I don't know," I said weakly from my hospital bed. "I don't want to impose on you, Patricia." She waved away my concern with a perfectly manicured hand. "Nonsense, dear. Family helps family. Besides, someone should be checking on the house regularly. You never know what could happen to a place that's been left empty for weeks." Mike looked relieved at his mother's offer. The past week had aged him, and I could see the exhaustion in every line of his face. "Mom's right, Jess. And she's retired, so she has the time. I'll give her the spare key, and she can just make sure everything's okay." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Mike handed over our spare key to Patricia, and for the next 2 weeks, she made regular trips to what she called checking on the house. She'd update us during her hospital visits, mentioning that she'd watered the plants, collected the mail, and made sure everything was secure. She even brought photos on her phone showing that the house looked exactly as we'd left it. I should have known something was wrong when she started wearing my clothes to the hospital. It began with a blazer, an expensive navy blue piece I'd bought for important client meetings. Patricia walked into my hospital room wearing it like it was her own, and when I commented on it, she laughed and said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind. I spilled coffee on my shirt at your house and borrowed this. I'll return it tomorrow." But the next day, she came wearing a different piece from my closet, and the day after that, another. When I gently asked her about it, she gave me that condescending smile I'd come to know so well. "I'm just borrowing a few things while I'm helping out. I thought you'd understand, given everything I'm doing for you." Mike didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't want to deal with it. He was already overwhelmed trying to manage work, hospital visits, and the growing stack of medical bills. Looking back, I think he was grateful to have one less thing to worry about, even if it meant letting his mother overstep boundaries. But the clothes were just the beginning. During the final week of my hospital stay, Patricia's visits became less frequent. When I asked Mike about it, he said she was busy organizing things at home in preparation for my return. He seemed nervous. When he said it, avoiding eye contact and changing the subject quickly when I pressed for details. "Is everything okay with the house?" I asked him one afternoon. He was sitting in his usual chair next to my bed, but he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the door. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mom's just been working hard to make sure you have an easy transition home. You know how she is. She likes everything to be perfect." That should have been my first clue. Patricia had never cared about making anything perfect for me before. In 5 years of marriage, she'd never shown the slightest interest in my comfort or well-being. The idea that she was suddenly working to ensure I had an easy transition should have set off every alarm bell I had. But I was still recovering, still dealing with pain and medication that made it hard to think clearly. I was focused on getting strong enough to go home, on relearning how to use my left arm, on managing the headaches that still plagued me from the concussion. I trusted Mike to handle things, and I trusted that even Patricia wouldn't do anything truly awful while I was helpless in a hospital bed. I couldn't have been more wrong. The day I was finally discharged, 3 weeks after the accident, Mike arrived to pick me up with an expression I'd never seen before. He seemed anxious, almost fearful, and when I asked him what was wrong, he just said he was worried about how I'd handle being home after so much time away. During the drive through familiar Portland streets, I felt a surge of excitement about returning to my sanctuary, my grandmother's house, my carefully curated collection of meaningful possessions. I couldn't wait to sleep in my own bed, to make coffee in my own kitchen, to surround myself with the comfort of familiar things after 3 weeks of sterile hospital rooms. As Mike pulled into our driveway, I noticed Patricia's white Lexus parked at the curb. "Why is your mother here?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling about the answer. Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She wanted to be here when you came home, to make sure the transition went smoothly." That phrase again. I was beginning to hate the word transition. Mike helped me out of the car, careful of my still healing arm, and we walked together toward the front door of my house. From the outside, everything looked normal. The rose bushes my grandmother had planted were still blooming. The porch swing where Mike and I used to sit on summer evenings was still there. The windows still gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. But the moment Mike unlocked the front door and I stepped inside, I knew that nothing would ever be normal again. My living room was empty. Not just clean, not just reorganized, empty. The antique coffee table that had been my grandmother's pride and joy was gone. The bookshelf that had held first edition novels and family photographs was missing entirely. The comfortable armchairs, where Mike and I had spent countless evenings reading and talking, had vanished. Even the area rug that had covered the hardwood floors had disappeared. I stood in the doorway, unable to process what I was seeing. "Mike," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Where is everything?" That's when Patricia emerged from the kitchen, wearing my favorite cashmere sweater and carrying herself with the satisfaction of someone who's accomplished a difficult but necessary task. In her hands was a manila folder thick with papers, and her smile was the kind of smile you give to a child who's about to learn an important lesson. "Welcome home, Jessica," she said, her voice honeyed with false sweetness. "I've taken care of absolutely everything while you were recovering. You don't need to worry about a single thing." Standing in what used to be my living room, I felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Everything familiar had been stripped away, leaving behind an echo chamber of empty space that somehow felt larger and smaller at the same time. The hardwood floors that my grandmother had so lovingly maintained gleamed bare under the afternoon light, every scratch and imperfection now visible without furniture to soften their appearance. Patricia stood there in my cashmere sweater, the cream-colored one I'd bought for special occasions, the one that had cost me a week's worth of grocery money, but that made me feel confident and put together when I wore it. On her, it looked different, more expensive somehow, as if the quality of the garment had been elevated by her wearing it. She held that manila folder like a trophy, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against its surface in a rhythm that suggested satisfaction with a job well done. "Where is my coffee table?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in the empty room. The question felt surreal, like asking someone where they'd put the sky or why gravity had stopped working. The cherry wood table that had anchored my living room for 5 years wasn't just missing. It was as if it had never existed at all. Patricia's smile remained fixed, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of what might have been anticipation. "Oh, Jessica, honey, don't worry about any of that right now. You've just come home from a terrible ordeal. Why don't you sit down and let me explain everything?" But there was nowhere to sit. The comfortable sectional sofa where Mike and I had watched movies, where we'd hosted friends for game nights, where I'd curled up on Sunday afternoons reading books, gone. The matching armchairs that had flanked the fireplace, inherited from my grandmother along with the house, vanished. Even the small ottoman that had served as both footrest and additional seating had disappeared. Mike stood frozen in the doorway. Behind me, his face a mask of guilt and confusion that I was only beginning to understand. He hadn't moved since we'd entered the house, hadn't spoken, hadn't offered any explanation for what we were seeing. His silence felt like another betrayal layered on top of the obvious one that surrounded us. "Mike," I said, turning to face my husband, "where is our furniture?" He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, looking toward his mother for guidance. That look, that instinctive turning toward Patricia for direction instead of toward me, his wife, cut deeper than I would have expected. In that moment, I realized that whatever had happened here hadn't been done behind his back. He'd known. He'd allowed it. He'd participated in it, even if only through silence. Patricia stepped forward, placing herself between Mike and me in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "Jessica, dear, I know this is a shock, but I need you to think about the bigger picture here. Those medical bills aren't going to pay themselves. Your insurance covered some of it, but there are still tens of thousands of dollars in expenses that someone needs to address." The manila folder appeared in front of me, opened to reveal a stack of paperwork that Patricia had clearly organized. With care. Hospital bills, insurance statements, medical supply invoices. All of it neatly arranged and highlighted in yellow marker to draw attention to the largest numbers. The amounts were staggering, far more than I'd expected even with insurance coverage. "You see?" Patricia continued, her voice taking on that patient, explaining to a child tone that I'd heard her use with Mike when she thought he was being foolish. "Someone had to make the difficult decisions while you were unconscious, and Mike was too emotional to think clearly. I looked at your finances, and frankly, Jessica, I was shocked at how little you have saved for emergencies." I stared. At the papers, my brain still foggy from the medication and the shock of what I was seeing. The numbers swam before my eyes, but even in my confused state, something didn't add up. Mike and I weren't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. We lived within our means, we had savings, and my work as a financial advisor meant I understood exactly what we could and couldn't afford. "Patricia," I said slowly, "I appreciate your concern, but Mike and I discussed our finances before I went to the hospital. We have an emergency fund. We have good insurance. We've always been responsible about money." Her laugh was light and airy, the kind of sound someone makes when they're humoring a child who doesn't understand how the world really works. "Oh, honey, you think you were responsible, but sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see the real situation. Your little emergency fund was barely enough to cover the first week of hospital bills. Mike was panicking about whether you'd have a home to come back to." I looked at Mike again, searching his face for confirmation or denial of what his mother was saying. He wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on a spot somewhere over my shoulder. "Is that true?" I asked him directly. "Were you worried about losing the house?" "Mom showed me the bills," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "In the empty room. The amounts just kept getting bigger. I knew we had some savings, but I didn't realize how quickly it would get eaten up. When she offered to help." His words trailed off, but the implication was clear. He'd been scared, overwhelmed by the financial responsibility and the emotional stress of potentially losing me, and his mother had appeared with a solution that seemed reasonable at the time. Patricia moved through the empty room with the confidence of someone who was exactly where she belonged. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floors, the sound echoing in the absence of furniture and rugs to absorb it. "I've been through this before, Jessica. When my first husband left Mike's father, I had to make hard choices about what was truly necessary and what was just excess. It's a valuable lesson, really. We accumulate so many things we don't actually need? My grandmother's furniture wasn't excess, I said, my voice growing stronger as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Those were family heirlooms. Were they? Patricia asked, tilting her head in that way people do when they're about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. Or were they just old furniture that you'd attached sentimental value to? Jessica, I've been in real estate for 20 years. I know the difference between genuinely valuable antiques and furniture that's simply old. Most of what you had here was the latter. She moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for us to follow her. Come on. Let me show you what I've done. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised when you see how much space you have now. A fresh start can be exactly what a marriage needs. The kitchen, when we reached it, was similarly transformed. The small breakfast table where Mike and I had shared our morning coffee was gone. The vintage canisters that had held flour and sugar, decorated with hand-painted flowers from the 1950s, had vanished. Even the kitchen curtains that my grandmother had made by hand were missing, leaving the windows stark and bare. What remained were the basics: the refrigerator, stove, and cabinets that were built into the structure of the house. On the counter sat a new coffee maker, a cheap plastic model that looked completely out of place in the vintage kitchen, and a small stack of generic white plates and bowls that I didn't recognize. I picked up some essentials at Target, Patricia explained, following my gaze to the mismatched dishes. Just enough to get you started. I figured you'd want to choose your own replacements for everything else. An opportunity to develop your own style instead of just living with whatever your grandmother left behind. The casual dismissal of my grandmother's memory, the reduction of a lifetime of careful choices and beautiful objects to whatever your grandmother left behind, hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just possessions Patricia had sold. They were connections to the woman who had raised me, who had taught me about beauty and quality, and the importance of surrounding yourself with things that brought joy. Where are my grandmother's dishes? I asked, opening the cabinet where her everyday china had been stored. The shelves were empty, except for the cheap Target replacements Patricia had mentioned. Sold, Patricia said matter-of-factly. I got a good price for them, actually. More than they were worth, in my opinion. There was a collector who specializes in mid-century dinnerware, and she was thrilled to add them to her collection. I opened another cabinet, then another, finding them all empty or containing unfamiliar items that Patricia had purchased as replacements. The crystal glasses my grandmother had used for special occasions, the serving pieces that had graced holiday, tables for decades, the vintage Pyrex bowls in cheerful colors that I'd used for baking, all gone. What about the dining room? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Mike finally spoke up, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. Mom said the dining set was too big for just the two of us. She found a family who really needed it, who could actually use all those chairs. The dining room, when we reached it, confirmed my fears. The walnut table that my grandmother had lovingly restored, the chairs with their intricate carved backs, the matching buffet where we'd stored linens and serving pieces, all of it gone. The room felt cavernous, the hardwood floors reflecting our footsteps in a way that made every sound seem amplified and empty. The family who bought it has 6 children, Patricia added, as if this information would somehow make me feel better about the loss. They were so grateful to find a set large enough for their needs. Your grandmother would have been happy to know it was going to a family who would really use it. But my grandmother had used it. We'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners. Around that table, Christmas mornings where Mike and I opened presents while drinking coffee from her good china. Birthday celebrations, anniversary dinners, quiet Sunday brunches where we'd read the newspaper and planned our week ahead. The table had been the heart of our home, the place where our marriage had been nourished through countless shared meals. Patricia continued her tour through the house, pointing out the improvements she'd made with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a home renovation project. In the guest bedroom, she'd removed the antique dresser that had held extra linens and my grandmother's collection of vintage jewelry. "No one ever used that old thing," she said dismissively. "And really, how much vintage jewelry does one person need?" The words hit me like ice water. My grandmother's jewelry wasn't just accessories. It was a tangible connection to her life, her special occasions, her memories. The pearl necklace she'd worn to her wedding, the sapphire earrings that had been a gift from my grandfather on their 10th anniversary, the simple gold bracelet she'd never taken off. These weren't just valuable objects, they were family history. "Where is my grandmother's jewelry?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Sold to a vintage jewelry dealer downtown. Don't worry, I made sure to get fair market value. Some of those pieces were actually quite valuable, more than I expected for costume jewelry." "It wasn't costume jewelry," I whispered. "Those were real pearls, real sapphires." That was her wedding ring. For the first time since we'd arrived home, Patricia looked slightly uncomfortable. "Well, the dealer seemed pleased with the purchase. I'm sure the pieces went to people who would appreciate them. But I had wanted to appreciate them. I had planned to pass them down to my own children someday, to tell them stories about their great-grandmother and the occasions when she'd worn each piece. Now those connections were severed, sold to strangers who would never know the love and history each item represented. As we moved through the house, the magnitude of Patricia's actions became clearer. The living room bookshelves that had held first-edition novels and family photographs sold to someone who collected vintage books. The hope chest at the foot of my bed that had contained quilts my grandmother had made by hand, gone to someone who does restoration work. Even the mirror in our bedroom, an ornate antique that had reflected 3 generations of women getting ready for their days, had been removed and sold to an antique dealer. "I made sure to document everything," Patricia said, producing another folder from her large purse. "Receipts for every sale, contact information for all the buyers. I ran this like a professional estate sale, Jessica. You should be grateful for how organized I kept everything." The word grateful stung more than any of the others. I was supposed to be grateful that someone had stripped my home of everything that made it mine, that connected me to my family, that told the story of my life. I was supposed to be thankful that Patricia had taken it upon herself to decide what I did and didn't need, what was valuable and what was just taking up space. Looking at the receipt she handed me, I could see that she hadn't been lying about documenting everything. Each sale was carefully recorded with the buyer's information, the items sold and the amount received. The organization was meticulous, almost obsessive in its detail, but the prices listed next to items I knew to be valuable seemed shockingly low. "How much did you get for the coffee table?" I asked, finding the entry in her records. $300, she said proudly, which was quite good considering its condition. The buyer said it needed some work to really bring out its potential. $300 for a piece that I knew was worth at least $3,000. My grandmother had taken me with her to have it appraised years ago when she was updating her insurance coverage. The dealer had called it a museum-quality example of mid-century craftsmanship. "And the dining set?" $800, Patricia replied. The family was so grateful, and really, what's money compared to knowing you've helped people in need? $800 for a set that I'd seen similar examples selling for over $5,000 in antique stores downtown. Either Patricia had been taken advantage of by every buyer, or she had deliberately undersold everything to move it quickly, without regard for the actual value. "Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "these prices seem very low. Did you get any of these items appraised before selling them?" She waved away my concern with an airy gesture. "Appraisals are just opinions, Jessica. The real value of something is what someone is willing to pay for it. And I found buyers for everything, which is more than you could say if you'd tried to sell these things yourself." The antique market is very competitive. Mike had been silent through most of this tour, following behind us like a reluctant participant in a museum exhibit he'd rather not be seeing. But as we stood in our empty bedroom, looking at the spaces where furniture used to be, he finally spoke up. "Maybe we should have waited until Jessica was released to make these decisions," he said quietly, not quite looking at either his mother or me. Patricia's expression sharpened, and for a moment, the mask of concerned helpfulness slipped to reveal something harder underneath. "Michael, you were falling apart. You couldn't sleep. You could barely function at work, and those bills kept coming. Someone had to take action. Would you have preferred to let your wife come home to foreclosure notices?" "We weren't going to lose the house," I said firmly. "Our mortgage payments are automatic, and we had enough in savings to cover several months of expenses, even with the medical bills." Patricia emphasized. "Past tense. Jessica, I've seen your bank statements. Mike gave me access so I could manage the bill payments while you were hospitalized. Your savings account was nearly depleted, and that was before the biggest bills started arriving." This didn't make sense. Mike and I had been careful with our money. We had a substantial emergency fund, good insurance, and I made decent money as a financial advisor. We weren't the kind of people who lived paycheck to paycheck, or who would be bankrupted by an unexpected medical expense. "Mike," I said, turning to my husband, "is she telling the truth about our bank account?" He shifted uncomfortably, still avoiding eye contact. "I gave her access to pay the bills while you were in the hospital. She handled all of that so I could focus on visiting you and keeping up with work. I didn't really look at the details." "You didn't look at our bank statements?" "At all? I trusted Mom to handle it," he said defensively. "She managed Dad's finances for years before he died. She knows about this stuff." The realization hit me like another wave of nausea. Not only had Patricia sold all of my belongings, but she'd had complete access to our financial accounts for 3 weeks. She'd been paying our bills, managing our money, making decisions about what we could and couldn't afford, all without my knowledge or consent. "I need to see our bank statements," I said. "Right now." Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, dear. Though I think you'll find I've been very careful with your money. Every penny was accounted for, every bill paid on. Time. I even managed to negotiate payment plans for some of the larger medical expenses." But as she spoke, I noticed her hand move protectively toward her purse, as if she was guarding something inside. The gesture was subtle, probably unconscious, but it made me wonder what other documents she might be carrying, what other surprises might be waiting for me to discover. The tour of my empty house continued, each room revealing new losses. In the bathroom, the vintage mirror with beveled edges that had hung above the sink for decades had been replaced with a cheap modern one from a big box store. The linen closet, that had held towels and sheets in a rainbow of colors collected over years, now stocked with a basic white set that Patricia had purchased as a temporary replacement. I know it's an adjustment," she said as we completed our circuit back to the living room. "But think of this as an opportunity. How many people get the chance to completely start over, to choose everything new? You can create exactly the kind of home you want instead of just living with whatever happened to be here." But I hadn't been living with whatever happened to be here. Every item in my house had been chosen carefully, either by me or by my grandmother, selected for its beauty, its function, or its meaning. The house hadn't been cluttered or overwhelming. It had been thoughtfully curated, filled with things that brought joy and comfort and connection to the past. Now it felt like a hotel room, functional but impersonal, containing only the most basic necessities for survival. The emptiness wasn't peaceful or serene. It was hollow and cold, like something vital had been extracted from the space. Patricia settled herself on the windowsill since there was nowhere else to sit, arranging the folders of paperwork on her lap with the satisfaction of someone presenting a completed project. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said, "but I really think you'll thank me for this once you've had time to adjust." Sometimes we need someone else to help us let go of the past so we can embrace the future." "The past?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You're talking about my grandmother's legacy, about family heirlooms that were irreplaceable." "Were they really irreplaceable, though?" Patricia asked, tilting her head in that condescending way she had perfected. "Or had you just convinced yourself they were because you hadn't learned to let go?" "Jessica, I've lived longer than you have. I've learned that holding on to too many material possessions can keep us trapped in the past instead of moving forward with our lives." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. This was coming from a woman whose own house was filled with expensive furniture and decorative objects, whose closet contained more clothing than some people owned in a lifetime, who had never met. A luxury item she didn't think she deserved. "Those weren't just possessions," I said, feeling tears of anger and grief threatening to overwhelm me. "They were connections to people I loved, to memories that mattered." Patricia's expression softened in what she probably thought was a motherly way. "And now you have the receipts and the memories, which are what really matter. The things themselves were just things. What matters is that we found a way to keep you in your home and out of debt. That's what your grandmother would have wanted, isn't it? For you to be financially secure?" "But my grandmother would have wanted me to have choices. She would have wanted me to decide for myself what was important and what could be sacrificed. She would have been horrified to know that someone had taken it upon themselves to dismantle everything she had carefully built and preserved." As the afternoon wore on and the full scope of Patricia's actions became clear, I began to understand that this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by financial panic. This had been systematic, thorough, and planned. She hadn't just sold a few items to raise quick cash. She had essentially conducted a complete estate sale of my belongings while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. The manila folders contained not just receipts and bills, but also photographs she had taken of each room before clearing it out, pricing lists she had compiled for different categories of items, and even a timeline showing which buyers had come, on which days. This wasn't the work of someone making desperate choices under pressure. This was the careful execution of a plan that had been thought through in detail. "You've put a lot of work into this," I said, flipping through the photographs. That showed my house as it had been just 3 weeks ago. Looking at the images of my grandmother's furniture in their familiar places, the books arranged on the shelves the way I had organized them, the decorative items that had made the house feel like home, I felt a grief that was almost physical in its intensity. "I pride myself on being thorough," Patricia replied. "When I commit to helping someone, I don't do things halfway. I wanted to make sure that every aspect of this situation was handled properly, that nothing was overlooked or forgotten. But something had been overlooked, the most important thing of all. In all of her careful planning and meticulous execution, Patricia had forgotten to consider that these weren't her decisions to make. She had forgotten that I was a capable adult who had the right to make my own choices about my own possessions, even if those choices didn't align with what she thought was practical or sensible." Standing in my empty living room as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the bare floors, I realized that this was about more than just furniture and jewelry and family heirlooms. This was about power and control, about Patricia's deep-seated belief that she knew better than everyone else what was right and proper and practical. She had seen an opportunity, with me unconscious and Mike overwhelmed, to impose her version of order on a situation she found chaotic. She had taken my vulnerability and used it as permission to reshape my life according to her standards, her values, her idea of what my home should look like. And Mike had let her do it. That might have been the most painful realization of all. "I think I need to lie down," I said finally. Exhaustion from the day, the medication, and the emotional impact of what I'd discovered washing over me in a wave that threatened to knock me off my feet. "Of course, dear," Patricia said, gathering. up her folders with the efficiency of someone wrapping up a successful business meeting. "You've had a big day. Get some rest, and tomorrow we can start thinking about what you want to buy to replace everything. I have some wonderful ideas about modern furniture that would really open up the space." The suggestion that I would want, her input on replacing the irreplaceable things she had sold was so presumptuous, so tone-deaf to what I was feeling, that I couldn't even formulate a response. I just nodded and headed toward the bedroom, hoping that sleep might provide some escape from the nightmare my life had become, but even the bedroom offered no comfort. The bed was still there, but without the hope chest at its foot, without the antique mirror that had reflected my face every morning for 5 years, without the family photographs that had smiled down at me from the dresser. It felt like sleeping in a stranger's room. As I lay there in the growing darkness, listening to Patricia and Mike talking in low voices in the kitchen, I began to understand that my recovery from the accident was just beginning. The broken bones would heal. The physical therapy would eventually restore function to my arm. The headaches would fade with time. But the damage Patricia had done to my home, to my trust, to my sense of security and autonomy, that would take much longer to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Sleep didn't come easily that first night back home. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through everything I'd seen and heard since walking through my front door. The pain medication made me drowsy, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of my empty house overlaid with memories of how it used to be. The coffee table where I'd done crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings. The bookshelf where I'd run my fingers along the spines of books while deciding what to read next. The jewelry box on my dresser where my grandmother's wedding ring had waited for special occasions. Mike had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhaustion from weeks of hospital visits and work stress finally catching up with him. But his sleep was restless, and I could hear him muttering and shifting beside me in the darkness. Occasionally, he would say a word clearly enough for me to understand. Mom, or bills, or sorry. Fragments of whatever dreams or guilt were playing out in his subconscious. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and made my way carefully to the kitchen, using the wall for support since I was still unsteady on my feet. The cheap coffee maker Patricia had bought sat on the counter like an insult to my grandmother's memory. For 60 years, she had used the same percolator every morning, the one that made coffee with a distinctive richness that I'd never been able to replicate with any modern machine. That percolator had been one of the first things I'd noticed, missing from my kitchen. I made coffee with the new machine, wincing at the weak, bitter taste, and sat at the counter on one of the mismatched stools Patricia had left behind. The kitchen felt wrong in ways that went beyond the missing furniture. Even the smell was different. Instead of the familiar mixture of coffee, herbs from my window garden, and the lingering scent of whatever I'd cooked last, there was a sterile, cleaning chemical odor that reminded me of the hospital. That's when I noticed the first real clue that something was more wrong than Patricia had admitted. On the windowsill above the sink, where my herb garden had flourished for years, sat 3 small plants I'd never seen before. They weren't herbs. They looked like cheap decorative plants from a grocery store, the kind you buy when you need something green but don't really care about gardening. My herbs had been carefully chosen and lovingly tended: basil, rosemary, thyme, and oregano that I'd used in cooking for years. The pots they'd grown in had been vintage ceramic pieces that my grandmother had collected from flea markets, each one unique and beautiful. These new plants sat in identical plastic pots with price stickers still partially visible on the bottom. But more telling than the plants themselves was what I found when I looked closer. In the corner of the windowsill, almost hidden behind one of the new pots, was a small piece of broken ceramic. It was painted with delicate blue flowers and had a chip that I recognized immediately, part of the pot that had held my rosemary plant. My rosemary hadn't died from neglect during my hospital stay. It had been deliberately removed and thrown away, the beautiful pot broken in the process. Patricia had then purchased cheap replacements to make it look like she had been caring for. living plants in my absence. This discovery hit me harder than I would have expected. The missing furniture, while devastating, could potentially be explained by financial desperation or misguided practicality. But there was no reason to throw away living plants and replace them with different ones except to cover up some aspect of what had really happened in my house. I spent the rest of the early morning hours wandering through my empty rooms, looking for other signs of deception. Dawn was breaking when I found the second clue in my bedroom closet. Patricia had mentioned that she'd borrowed some of my clothes, which had been obvious from seeing her wear my blazer and sweater. But as I examined my closet more closely, I realized the extent of what was missing wasn't just a few borrowed items. Entire categories of clothing had disappeared. All of my professional blazers, most of my designer pieces, anything that was clearly expensive or high quality. What remained were basics: jeans, t-shirts, casual dresses, and workout clothes. It was as if someone had gone through my wardrobe and kept only the items that couldn't be sold or that weren't worth the effort. And hanging at the far end of the closet, as if it had been forgotten or overlooked, was a dress I'd never seen before. A cheap polyester piece with the tag still attached, sized to fit Patricia rather than me. She hadn't just borrowed my clothes. She had essentially cleaned out my wardrobe and replaced select items with cheaper alternatives, hoping I wouldn't notice or that I'd be too overwhelmed by everything else to care about missing clothes. When Mike woke up around 7, he found me sitting on the floor of our walk-in closet, holding that unfamiliar dress in my hands. "Jess?" he said, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What are you doing?" "This dress," I said, showing him the polyester garment. "Have you ever seen it before?" He rubbed his eyes and looked at the dress without much interest. "No, I don't think so. Maybe Mom picked it up for you? She mentioned getting some basic things to tide you over until you could go shopping yourself. But the dress wasn't basic, and it wasn't in my size. It was a specific style that would look good on Patricia's figure, but would hang awkwardly on mine. She hadn't bought it for me at all. She'd bought it for herself, and somehow it had ended up in my closet. Probably by mistake. "Mike," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I need you to think carefully about what your mother told you while I was in the hospital, about our finances, about selling things, about what decisions she was making, because I'm finding evidence that she wasn't entirely truthful about what she was doing here." He sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, running his hands through his hair. "She showed me the bills, Jess. They were enormous. She said we needed to act quickly or we'd lose everything. But did you see our actual bank statements? Did you look at what we had in savings versus what we owed?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Mike had been scared and overwhelmed, and when his mother had appeared with solutions and explanations, he had chosen to trust her expertise rather than examine the details himself. "She handled all of that," he said finally. "She's good with money, and I was barely keeping up with work and visiting you. I figured it was better to let her manage the financial stuff while I focused on making sure you were okay." "And the furniture? The jewelry? Did she discuss those specific items with you before selling them?" Another pause, longer this time. "She showed me some of the bigger bills and said we needed to raise money quickly. She said she'd start with items we didn't really need, things that were just taking up space. She made it sound like just a few pieces, not..." He gestured helplessly around our empty room. The picture that was emerging made me feel sick. Patricia hadn't just taken advantage of my absence to make unauthorized decisions. She had systematically manipulated Mike's fear and stress to get his permission for increasingly invasive actions. She had shown him carefully selected bills to create maximum alarm, then positioned herself as the solution to problems that might not have been as severe as she'd claimed. When Mike left for work that morning, promising to get to the bottom of what had happened with his mother, I decided to do some investigating of my own. My laptop had been one of the few items Patricia hadn't touched, probably because it was clearly necessary for my work. and I used it to log into our bank accounts, online. What I found there confirmed my worst suspicions. Patricia hadn't just been paying our bills during my hospital stay. She had been moving money between accounts, transferring funds from our long-term savings into our checking account to make it look like we were depleting our emergency fund faster than we actually were. She had also set up several automatic payments that weren't bills at all, but payments to accounts I didn't recognize. More troubling still, I discovered that she had opened a new credit card in Mike's name, one that he apparently didn't know about, and had been using it to make purchases that weren't related to our household expenses. The statement showed charges at high-end department stores, expensive restaurants, and even a spa where Patricia had apparently treated herself to several luxury services. She had been using our financial vulnerability as an opportunity to live beyond her own means, charging her personal expenses to us while simultaneously selling our possessions to cover the debts she was creating. The more I dug through the financial records, the more complex the deception became. Patricia had been managing our money with the skill of someone who had done this kind of manipulation before, creating a paper trail that would seem to support her story about financial crisis while actually engineering that crisis through her own actions. When my phone rang around noon, I was so deep in spreadsheets and account statements that the sound made me jump. The caller ID showed my best friend, Rachel's name, a welcome relief from the isolation and confusion I'd been feeling. "Jess, I've been calling the hospital trying to reach you. Mike told me you were finally discharged. How are you feeling?" Rachel's voice was warm and concerned, and I found myself choking up just hearing a friendly, familiar sound. "I'm home," I managed to say. "But Rachel, everything's gone wrong. I need help figuring out what happened while I was away." "What do you mean? What's wrong?" I spent the next hour telling Rachel everything. The empty house, Patricia's explanations, the financial irregularities I'd discovered, the signs that pointed to deliberate deception rather than desperate necessity. Rachel listened without interruption, occasionally making sounds of shock or dismay. "Jess," she said when I'd finished, "this is insane. I mean, I never liked Patricia, but this is straight-up theft. You've got to call the police." "I don't know if I can prove anything." "Criminal," I said. "She has receipts for everything she sold. And technically, Mike gave her permission to manage our finances. But he didn't give her permission to steal your clothes and forge credit cards in his name," Rachel pointed out. "And even if the furniture sales were legal, selling someone's family heirlooms while they're unconscious in the hospital is morally reprehensible." Rachel's outrage on my behalf was comforting, but it also made me realize how isolated I had become. Mike's reaction to the situation had been guilt and defensiveness rather than the righteous anger I needed from him. He seemed more concerned about avoiding conflict with his mother than about supporting me through this crisis. "There's something else," Rachel continued. "I don't know if this is related, but I saw Patricia at the mall about 2 weeks ago when you were still in the hospital. She was coming out of that expensive boutique on the second floor, carrying several shopping bags. She was wearing a blazer I'd never seen before. Really beautiful, obviously expensive." My stomach dropped. "What color was the blazer?" "Navy blue with gold buttons. Very professional looking." It was my blazer. The one I'd bought for important client meetings. The one that Patricia had claimed to be borrowing when she first started wearing my clothes to the hospital. She hadn't been borrowing it. She had been stealing it, along with everything else she thought she could get away with taking. "Rachel," I said, "I need you to do me a favor. Do you remember that antique shop on Hawthorne where I bought the birthday present for your mom last year? Could you go there and ask if anyone has tried to sell them vintage jewelry recently? Specifically, if a woman in her 50s brought in estate jewelry about 2 weeks ago." "Of course. But Jess, are you safe there by yourself? Maybe you should come stay with me until you figure this out." The offer was tempting, but I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning my house again, even in its current empty state. I'll be okay. Mike will be home tonight, and I need to be here to deal with this situation. But when Mike came home that evening, instead of the support and clarity I'd hoped for, he brought more confusion and troubling news. "I talked to Mom today," he announced as soon as he walked through the door. "She's really upset that you're questioning her motives. She says she's hurt that you can't see how much she was trying to help us." The fact that his first words weren't an apology or an explanation, but rather a defense of his mother's feelings, told me volumes about where his loyalties lay. "Mike, I found credit card charges that we didn't make. Money moved between accounts without our authorization. She's been lying to us about more than just the furniture." He loosened his tie and sat down heavily on one of the kitchen stools, suddenly looking much older than his 35 years. She explained all of that. The credit card was for emergency expenses related to your care, things insurance didn't cover, and she moved the money around to make sure all the bills got paid on time. What emergency expenses cost $800 at Nordstrom? Mike's face flushed. "She had to buy appropriate clothes for visiting you in the hospital. She couldn't wear work clothes every day, and she wanted to look presentable when talking to your doctors." The rationalization was so weak, so obviously fabricated, that I wondered if Mike actually believed it, or if he was just repeating what Patricia had told him because believing it was easier than facing the truth. "Mike, those weren't her clothes. She bought at Nordstrom. They were my clothes. She took my blazer, my good dresses, probably my shoes and jewelry too. She's been systematically stealing from us and using our financial crisis as cover." "That's not what happened," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mom wouldn't steal from us. She was trying to help." "Then explain the plants." "What plants?" I led him to the kitchen window and showed him the cheap replacements for my herb garden. "These aren't my plants. My herbs were in ceramic pots that my grandmother collected. Now they're in plastic pots from the grocery store, and I found pieces of the broken ceramic hidden behind them." Mike stared at the plants as if he'd never seen them before. "Maybe she replanted them. Maybe the old pots got broken accidentally. Or maybe she threw away my plants and bought these cheap ones to cover up the fact that she wasn't taking care of anything while I was gone. Maybe the whole story about maintaining the house was a lie." We stood in tense silence for several minutes, the weight of implications hanging between us like a physical barrier. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said you'd react this way. She said you'd be emotional and angry and wouldn't be able to see reason. She said grief and medication might make you paranoid." The words hit me like a slap. Not only had Patricia manipulated Mike into enabling her theft, but she had also prepared him for my response, framing any objections I might have as symptoms of mental instability, rather than legitimate concerns about criminal behavior. "So that's it?" I asked. "I'm supposed to just accept that everything I inherited from my grandmother, everything that connected me to my family history, is gone because your mother decided it was best for me? And when I object to that, I'm paranoid and emotional?" Mike reached for me, but I stepped back, suddenly feeling like I couldn't trust his touch any more than I could trust his words. "Jess, I know this is hard, but maybe Mom has a point about starting fresh. Maybe holding on to all those old things was keeping you from moving forward." It was Patricia's voice coming out of Mike's mouth, her words and her philosophy about what my life should look like. In 3 weeks, she had not only stolen my possessions, but also poisoned my husband against me, turning him into a spokesperson for her vision of what was best for our marriage. That night, after Mike had fallen asleep, I sat in my empty living room and made a decision. I couldn't rely on my husband to stand up to his mother or to see through her manipulations. I couldn't trust that he would prioritize my feelings and rights over his mother's explanations and justifications. If I wanted justice, if I wanted my life back, I would have to fight for it myself. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against. And as I stared out the window at Patricia's luxury car still parked at the curb, she'd apparently decided to stay for dinner and hadn't left yet, I began to suspect that the deception ran much deeper than stolen furniture and forged credit cards. Something Rachel had said earlier kept echoing in my mind. Patricia's shopping trip to the expensive boutique 2 weeks ago, the navy blazer with gold buttons, the obvious signs of someone with money to spend. If Patricia and Robert were financially comfortable, as their lifestyle suggested, why had Patricia been so eager to solve our supposed financial crisis? Why had she been so quick to turn my personal possessions into cash? The answer, I was beginning to realize, might have less to do with helping us and more to do with helping herself. And if that was true, then everything she had told us about our finances, about the necessity of selling my inheritance, about the bills that needed immediate attention, all of it might be an elaborate construction designed to benefit her rather than us. As I watched Patricia finally leave our house around 10 o'clock that night, carrying 2 shopping bags that I was certain contained more of my belongings, I made another decision. Tomorrow, I would start making phone calls and asking questions that went beyond what Patricia had told us. I would talk to the people who had bought my grandmother's furniture, to the jewelry dealer who had purchased family heirlooms, to the hospital billing department about what we actually owed versus what Patricia claimed we owed. I would stop being a victim of circumstances and start being an investigator of the truth. Because something told me that once I started pulling on the threads of Patricia's story, the entire fabric of her deception would begin to unravel. And when it did, I intended to be ready with evidence and allies rather than just anger and accusations. The game of sympathy and manipulation that Patricia had been playing was about to become something much more serious. She had underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my resources. That would turn out to be her biggest mistake. Thursday morning arrived with an unusual clarity, as if the fog that had clouded my thoughts since returning from the hospital had finally lifted. I woke before dawn, not from pain or restlessness this time, but from a sense of purpose that had been building since my conversation with Rachel the day before. Mike was still sleeping, his breathing heavy and undisturbed, completely unaware that today would change everything between us, between all of us. I made coffee with the cheap machine Patricia had left, grimacing at the weak taste but needing the caffeine to sharpen my focus for what lay ahead. On the kitchen counter, I had organized all the evidence I'd gathered over the past few days: bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, credit card bills for purchases we hadn't made, receipts for items sold at far below their actual value, and photographs I'd printed of my house as it had been before Patricia's intervention. My first call was to the billing department at OHSU Hospital. After being transferred through several departments and waiting on hold for what felt like forever, I finally reached someone who could access my account. Mrs. Miller? Yes, I see your file here. You were discharged on Tuesday, correct? Is there something about your bill that we can help you with? I need to understand exactly what our outstanding balance is, I said, pulling out the paperwork Patricia had given me. My mother-in-law has been handling our finances, and I want to make sure I have accurate information. There was the sound of typing, then a pause. Well, Mrs. Miller, according to our records, your account shows a remaining balance of $8,400 after insurance adjustments. Your mother-in-law set up a payment plan for $200 per month starting next month. $8,000. Patricia's paperwork had claimed we owed over $40,000. I'm sorry, I said, certain I had misheard. Could you repeat that amount? $8,400. Is that not what you were expecting? My hands started shaking. The bills Patricia had shown Mike, the papers she had used to justify selling everything I owned, had been inflated by more than $30,000. Either she had included bills from other sources that she hadn't explained, or she had simply lied about the amounts to create a crisis that didn't exist. Could you email me a detailed breakdown of all charges and insurance payments? I asked. I need to see exactly what we owe and what's already been covered. Of course. I'll send that to the email address we have on file. My next call was to our insurance company. After another series of transfers and hold times, I reached a claims specialist who confirmed what the hospital had told me. The majority of my medical expenses had been covered under our policy, and our out-of-pocket maximum meant we would never owe more than $12,000 total for the entire incident, including follow-up care and physical therapy. Between the hospital bill and the insurance out-of-pocket maximum, our total medical debt was less than $15,000. Our emergency savings account had contained over $20,000 before Patricia started managing our finances. The financial crisis she had described, the desperate need to sell family heirlooms to keep us afloat, had never existed. Armed with this information, I made my third call to Rachel. Jess, perfect timing. I was just about to call you. I went to that antique shop you mentioned yesterday, and you're not going to believe what I found out. Tell me everything, I said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs Patricia had left in my kitchen. So, I talked to the owner, Mrs. Chen, and she remembered the transaction perfectly. A woman in her 50s brought in a collection of vintage jewelry about 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Chen said she tried to explain that some of the pieces were quite valuable, especially a sapphire ring and a pearl necklace. But the woman insisted she just wanted quick cash and didn't care about getting full value. My grandmother's ring, my grandmother's pearls, gone for a fraction of their worth because Patricia couldn't be bothered to get proper appraisals. But here's the interesting part, Rachel continued. Mrs. Chen said the woman mentioned she had a lot more items to sell and would be back with furniture and other antiques. She gave Mrs. Chen her card in case any collectors came looking for specific pieces. Rachel paused dramatically. The card said, Patricia Thompson, estate sales specialist. Estate sales specialist. Not someone desperately trying to help her son and daughter-in-law through a financial crisis, but someone who had turned my personal tragedy into a business opportunity. Rachel, she's been running an estate sale out of my house while I was unconscious. She's been presenting herself as a professional dealer, not as someone helping family. That's probably why she got such low prices. She was treating it like inventory to move quickly, rather than precious items that needed careful placement. There's more, Rachel said. I asked Mrs. Chen if she still had any of the jewelry, and she said a collector from Seattle had bought most of it, but she still had one piece that hadn't sold yet, the sapphire ring. She's holding it because she felt bad about how little she paid for it and wanted to give the original owner a chance to buy it back. My grandmother's ring, the one that was supposed to be passed down through generations, the one I had planned to wear on my own wedding day and save for my future children. It was still within reach. How much would it cost to get it back? That's the thing. Mrs. Chen felt so guilty about the whole transaction that she's willing to sell it back to you at cost. She said no one should have to buy back their own family heirlooms. After I hung up with Rachel, I sat in my empty kitchen and let the full magnitude of Patricia's deception sink in. This hadn't been a panicked response to overwhelming bills. This had been a calculated scheme to profit from my situation while presenting herself as a selfless helper. She had manipulated Mike's fear and confusion to gain access to our house and accounts. She had exaggerated our debts and minimized our resources to create justification for selling my possessions. She had positioned herself as an estate sales professional to get quick cash while keeping the difference between the real values and what she claimed things were worth. And all the while, she had been shopping with our money, using our credit cards, and taking my clothes and possessions for her own use. My phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Is this Jessica Miller? A woman's voice asked. Yes, this is Jessica. My name is Carol Henderson. I bought a walnut dining set from a Patricia Thompson about 10 days ago. She said it came from an estate sale. But something about the transaction has been bothering me, and I was wondering if I could ask you some questions. My heart started racing. What kind of questions? Well, Mrs. Thompson said the furniture came from an elderly woman who had passed away and whose family just wanted to clear the house quickly. But when I got the furniture home and was cleaning I found some personal items that had been left in the drawers. Family photographs, letters, things that seemed too personal to have been overlooked in a professional estate sale. I closed my eyes, picturing my grandmother's dining room drawers where family photos and important papers had been stored. Items I hadn't even thought to check for before Patricia had sold the entire set. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you, directly? Do any of those photographs show a woman in her 70s with silver hair who looks like she might be my grandmother? Because that dining set wasn't from an estate sale. It was stolen from my house while I was in the hospital. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Oh my God," Carol finally said. "I was afraid something like this had happened." The whole transaction felt wrong from the beginning. Mrs. Thompson was so eager to complete the sale, wouldn't let me negotiate or think about it. She just wanted cash immediately. Carol Henderson turned out to be exactly the kind of person I needed to meet. A retired teacher with a strong sense of justice and a detailed memory of everything Patricia had told her during the sale. More importantly, she had kept all the personal items she'd found in the furniture, hoping to return them to their rightful owner someday. We arranged to meet at her house that afternoon, and when I arrived, I found not just my family photographs and papers, but also Carol's own documentation of the transaction. She had photographed everything, including Patricia's business card and the condition of the furniture when it arrived. "I've been thinking about calling the police," Carol said, as she handed me a box of family memorabilia I thought had been lost forever. This woman clearly misrepresented the source of these items. What she did to you while you were helpless in the hospital, that's not just theft, it's something worse. Looking through the photographs and letters Patricia had carelessly left, in the furniture she sold, I felt a rage building that was different from anything I'd experienced before. These weren't just possessions she had taken. They were pieces of my family's story, irreplaceable documents and images that connected me to generations of women who had come before me. Among the papers was something I hadn't even known existed, a handwritten letter from my grandmother to me, sealed in an envelope with my name on it, but marked, "To be opened when Jessica owns her own home." I had owned this house for 7 years, but somehow I had never found this letter in all the places my grandmother might have hidden it. Inside the envelope was not just a letter, but legal documents that would change everything. "My dearest Jessica," the letter began in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means you've made the house on Hawthorne Street truly your own. I hope you've filled it with love and laughter, with friends and perhaps children of your own someday. But I also want you to know that I've taken steps to ensure this house will always be yours, no matter what circumstances might arise." The legal documents attached to the letter were a revelation. My grandmother had not simply left me the house, she had placed it in a trust that protected it from creditors, from divorce proceedings, and from any attempts by others to force its sale. More importantly, the trust included language specifically protecting the contents of the house, designating them as heirloom property that could not be sold or removed without the express written consent of the primary beneficiary. Me. Everything Patricia had sold had been protected under the terms of this trust. She hadn't just committed theft, she had violated a legal trust that carried serious criminal penalties. But the biggest shock was still to come. The trust documents included a list of assets and investments my grandmother had left to support the maintenance of the house and the welfare of its inhabitants. Among these assets was notation of something called the Thompson Riverside Property Investment, dated 3 years earlier. Thompson, Patricia's married name. With shaking hands, I called the phone number listed for the trust's legal administrator. After explaining who I was and providing the trust identification numbers from my grandmother's papers, I was transferred to a senior partner who had personally handled my grandmother's estate planning. Ms. Miller, I've been expecting your call for some time, the lawyer said. Your grandmother was very specific about the protection she wanted in place, particularly regarding any threats to the property or its contents. She was quite concerned about potential future pressures you might face. Mr. Rodriguez, I need to understand what this Thompson Riverside property investment represents. There was a pause, as if he was checking documents on his end. That represents your grandmother's purchase of a mortgage note on a property in Lake Oswego, Oregon. She acquired it from a bank that was liquidating assets. The property is located at 1247 Elm Street, and the current mortgage holders are Patricia and Robert Thompson. The room seemed to tilt around me. My grandmother, quietly, without fanfare, without mentioning it to anyone, had bought the mortgage on Patricia's house 3 years ago. Patricia had been making her monthly payments to a trust fund that ultimately belonged to me, never knowing that the woman she looked down on as inadequate for her son was actually her mortgage holder. Mr. Rodriguez, what's the current status of that mortgage? According to our records, Mrs. Thompson is currently 63 days past due on her payments. The trust has been automatically applying late fees as outlined in the mortgage agreement. Under the terms of the original loan, if payment becomes 90 days delinquent, the trust has the option to call in the full balance of the loan or begin foreclosure proceedings. 63 days past due. That meant Patricia had stopped making mortgage payments right around the time I had my accident, while she was selling my possessions to cover what she claimed were our overwhelming debts. She wasn't even keeping up with her own financial obligations. There's something else you should know, Ms. Miller. The trust agreement includes specific language regarding any illegal actions taken against trust property or assets. If someone commits theft or fraud related to protected items, the trust is authorized to take immediate action to recover damages and protect the beneficiary's interests. When I hung up the phone, I sat in Carol Henderson's living room, surrounded by the family photos and mementos Patricia had carelessly discarded, holding legal documents that gave me more power than I had ever imagined possible. Patricia had spent weeks manipulating my husband, stealing my possessions, and positioning herself as my financial savior, all while failing to make payments on the mortgage that I now controlled. She had underestimated not just my grandmother's foresight, but the legal protections that had been put in place specifically to prevent exactly the kind of exploitation I had experienced. Carol was watching me with obvious concern. Jessica, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, I said, carefully folding my grandmother's letter and placing it back in its envelope. More like a guardian angel who's still looking out for me. That evening, when Mike came home from work, I was sitting at our empty dining table with all the evidence spread out before me. The real hospital bills, the bank statements showing unauthorized charges, the trust documents, and the mortgage. Information Patricia didn't know I had. Jess, what's all this? He asked, loosening his tie and looking at the papers with obvious anxiety. This is the truth, I said calmly. The truth about what your mother really did while I was in the hospital, and the truth about what happens next. I walked him through everything. The actual amount of our medical debt versus what Patricia had claimed. The evidence of her using our accounts for personal purchases. The items she had taken for herself rather than sold. And finally, the trust documents that made everything she had done criminally prosecutable. Mike's face went through a series of expressions as I explained. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of resigned sadness that told me he had suspected more than he had admitted, even to himself. But the mortgage thing, he said, finally, focusing on what had clearly shocked him most. You're saying you could foreclose on my mother's house. I'm saying I own the note on her mortgage, she's behind on payments, and under the terms of the loan, I have legal options to pursue. But more importantly, Mike, I'm saying that everything she took from me was protected under a trust that makes her actions not just theft, but a federal crime. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the documents as if they might change if he looked at them long enough. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past hour. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. It was a fair question, but also the wrong one. What I wanted was for him to be as angry as I was about what his mother had done. What I wanted was for him to volunteer to confront her without me having to ask. What I wanted was for him to choose his wife's rights and dignity over his mother's feelings and reputation. Instead, he was asking me to tell him what to do, which meant he still saw this as a conflict between two women that he needed to mediate rather than a clear case of criminal behavior that demanded his unequivocal support for the victim. "I want you to call your mother," I said finally, "and tell her she needs to return every single item she took from this house that hasn't been sold. I want you to tell her she needs to provide detailed accounting of where every penny of our money went. And I want you to tell her that she has 48 hours to make this right before I involve the police." Mike nodded, but I could see the reluctance in his eyes. "And if she won't? If she says you're overreacting or being vindictive? Then I'll use every legal tool at my disposal to get back what she stole, starting with calling in the mortgage on her house." That night, Mike made the phone call while I listened from the kitchen. I could hear Patricia's voice rising in anger and indignation, could hear her using all the manipulation tactics she had perfected over the years. She called me ungrateful, accused me of being influenced by people who didn't have our family's best interests at heart, and threatened to cut off all contact with Mike if he didn't stand up to me. "Mom," I heard Mike say finally, his voice stronger than it had been since I'd come home from the hospital. "Jessica has documentation for everything. This isn't about hurt feelings anymore. This is about returning stolen property and paying back money that wasn't yours to spend. You have 2 days to figure out how to make this right." When he hung up the phone, he looked older, but somehow more solid than he had in weeks. "She's not going to make this easy," he warned. "I didn't expect her to," I replied. "But she has no idea what I'm prepared to do to get my life back." 2 days later, Patricia arrived at our house with her lawyer, a folder of documents, and an attitude that suggested she was prepared for battle. She had returned some of my clothes, but claimed that most of the furniture and jewelry had been sold to buyers who couldn't be contacted. She had a check for $3,000, which she said represented the majority of what she owed us, minus expenses she had incurred while managing our affairs. $3,000 for possessions worth over $50,000. It was an insult disguised as a compromise. "Patricia," I said, sitting across from her at our empty dining table, "this isn't a negotiation. These are the terms. You will provide contact information for every buyer and documentation of every sale. You will return every item that can be returned and provide fair market compensation for everything that can't be. And you will repay every cent you spent from our accounts on your personal expenses." She laughed, actually laughed, as if I had told a particularly amusing joke. "Or what, Jessica? You'll take us to court? Do you have any idea how expensive litigation is? How long it takes? You can't afford to fight us, and we both know it." That's when I placed the mortgage documents on the table between us. "You're 63 days past due on your mortgage, Patricia. To be precise, you owe $47,000 in back payments and late fees to the trust that holds your loan. I am that trust's beneficiary and primary decision maker." The color drained from her face as she picked up the documents and scanned them. Her lawyer leaned over to read them as well, and I saw him whisper something urgent in her ear. "This is impossible," she said, but her voice had lost all its confidence. "How could you own our mortgage?" My grandmother was a very intelligent woman who understood that sometimes people need protection from those who would take advantage of their vulnerabilities. She put systems in place to ensure I would never be left defenseless. Patricia's lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, if these documents are authentic, your legal position is significantly compromised. The trust has substantial grounds for immediate foreclosure proceedings. especially given the allegations of theft from trust-protected property. For the first time since I had known her, Patricia Thompson had nothing to say. She sat staring at the papers in her hands as if they were written in a foreign language, as if she couldn't quite process that her position of power had evaporated so completely and so quickly. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "You're going to return everything you can return. You're going to pay fair market value for everything you can't return. You're going to reimburse us for every unauthorized expense, and you're going to bring your mortgage payments current immediately." "And if I don't?" she asked, but the fight had gone out of her voice. "Then you'll lose your home, face criminal charges for theft and fraud, and learn what it feels like to have someone else make decisions about your life while you're powerless to stop them." 3 hours later, Patricia and her lawyer left our house with a comprehensive agreement that would restore as much as possible of what had been taken from me. It would take time, and some things would never be recovered, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. Mike and I stood in our empty living room after they left, surrounded by the echo of our voices and the sound of justice finally being served. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what Mom was really doing." I nodded, accepting his apology but understanding that our relationship had been fundamentally changed by these events. Patricia had shown me that Mike could be manipulated into betraying my interests, and that awareness would color every interaction we had going forward. But for now, that was a problem for another day. Today was about reclaiming my life, my home, and my sense of security. Tomorrow, I would start the process of rebuilding what Patricia had destroyed. And I would do it with the knowledge that my grandmother was still looking out for me, still protecting me, still teaching me lessons about strength and justice from beyond the grave. The weeks that followed Patricia's capitulation transformed my house from an empty shell back into something resembling a home, though not the same home it had been before. Some things could be recovered. Carol Henderson insisted on returning my grandmother's dining set at no charge, saying it belonged with family where it had always been meant to stay. The antique dealer, Mrs. Chen, not only held my grandmother's sapphire ring for me, but also helped me track down several other pieces of jewelry that had been sold to collectors who were willing to part with them once they learned the true story behind the sales. But many things were gone forever. The books couldn't be traced. Patricia had sold them to a used bookstore that had already resold them to unknown buyers scattered across the city. My grandmother's china had been shipped to a collector in California who refused to respond to any attempts at contact. The vintage Pyrex bowls, the hand-embroidered linens, the small decorative items that had made the house feel warm and lived in, these had disappeared into the vast network of estate sales and antique shops, becoming treasures in other people's homes while leaving holes in mine. Each recovered item felt like a small victory, but each irretrievable loss was a fresh wound. I found myself photographing everything as I brought it back into the house, creating a digital inventory that my grandmother had never needed because she had lived with these things every day for decades, knowing their stories and their places, as intimately as she knew her own memories. Mike threw himself into the restoration process with an energy that bordered on frantic. He took vacation days to drive to Portland suburbs, where some of our furniture had been sold, negotiating with buyers and offering to pay above what Patricia had charged to get pieces back. He spent weekends refinishing items that had been damaged or altered, trying to restore them to exactly how they had been before his mother had interfered with our lives. His guilt was palpable and exhausting to be around. Every evening he would show me whatever he had recovered or repaired that day, searching my face for signs of forgiveness that I wasn't sure I was ready to give. The problem wasn't just that he had enabled Patricia's theft. It was that he had chosen to believe her version of events, even when the evidence contradicted her claims. Even now, repairing the damage, he seemed to be working from a sense of obligation rather than genuine outrage at what his mother had done. "I talked to Mom again today," he announced one evening as we sat in the living room, which now contained an odd mixture of recovered original pieces and new furniture we'd had to buy to fill the gaps. She wanted me to tell you how sorry she is about the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? As if weeks of systematic theft could be reduced to a simple miscommunication between reasonable people. Mike, I said carefully, it wasn't a misunderstanding. Your mother stole from us, lied to us, and manipulated both of our vulnerabilities for her own gain. The only thing she's sorry about is getting caught. He set down the beer he'd been drinking and turned to face me. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but she's still my mother. We're still going to have to deal with her for the rest of our lives. That phrase, for the rest of our lives, hit me like cold water. Mike was thinking about managing this relationship long-term, about finding ways to maintain family harmony despite what had happened. He was already planning how to minimize conflict at future holidays and family gatherings, how to move past this incident without letting it permanently damage the family dynamic. I was thinking about whether I wanted to be part of a family dynamic. That included Patricia at all. The mortgage situation had resolved itself in Patricia's favor, though not without significant cost. She had managed to bring the payments current by liquidating some of her own investments and borrowing against Robert's retirement account. She had written a check for the full amount of restitution we had calculated, though I suspected the money had come from sources other than her personal accounts. More importantly, she had been forced to provide documentation of every sale, every transaction, every decision she had made while managing our affairs. Going through those records with our lawyer had been like reading a textbook case in financial manipulation. The way she had moved money between accounts to create the appearance of crisis, the charges she had made to our credit cards for her own benefit, the way she had systematically undervalued everything she sold to ensure quick transactions that benefited buyers at our expense. Mrs. Miller, our lawyer had said during one of our meetings, I've seen a lot of financial abuse cases over the years, but this was unusually sophisticated. Your mother-in-law knew exactly what she was doing at every step. This wasn't panic or poor judgment. This was a deliberate scheme to profit from your vulnerability. The word scheme had stuck with me. This hadn't been an older woman making difficult decisions under pressure. This had been a calculated plan to exploit my absence and Mike's emotional state for financial gain, carefully executed by someone who had probably done similar things before. That realization led me to make some inquiries of my own. Through my work connections in the financial planning industry, I was able to access databases that tracked certain types of business activities. What I found was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Patricia Thompson wasn't just a random opportunist who had taken advantage of our situation. She had been operating an unlicensed estate sale business for nearly 5 years, targeting elderly clients and recently bereaved families who needed help liquidating property quickly. She used her background in real estate and her polished professional demeanor to gain trust, then systematically undervalued items to ensure rapid sales that generated substantial profits for herself. Our situation had just been another business opportunity for her, complicated only by the fact that I had survived and recovered enough to ask questions about what had happened to my belongings. I shared this information with Mike one evening as we worked together to rearrange the living room furniture we'd managed to recover. He listened in silence, his face growing pale as I explained how his mother had been running essentially a legalized theft operation for years. "Are you going to report her to the authorities?" he asked when I finished. "I'm thinking about it," I said honestly. "Other families deserve to know what they're dealing with if they hire her services." Mike set down the lamp he'd been holding and sat heavily in one of the rescued armchairs. "This is going to destroy our family." "Mike, she already destroyed our family. She violated our trust, stole our possessions, and manipulated you into helping her do it. I'm just talking about making sure she can't do the same thing to other vulnerable people." But I could see in his eyes that he still thought in terms of family loyalty and reputation management rather than justice and accountability. He was more concerned about what Patricia's exposure would mean for family dynamics than about preventing her from victimizing other families in the future. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about Patricia. This was about fundamental differences between Mike and me and how we viewed right and wrong, how we handled conflict, and what we considered acceptable behavior within families. The trust documents my grandmother had left included provisions for ongoing legal support, and I found myself spending increasing amounts of time with the law firm that managed her estate. Not just because of the practical matters related to recovering my belongings, but because these lawyers understood that what had happened to me was serious, criminal behavior that deserved appropriate consequences. You have grounds for both civil and criminal action, the senior partner explained during one of our consultations. The criminal charges would be handled by the district attorney's office, but you could file a civil suit for damages that go beyond the actual value of what was stolen: emotional distress, violation of trust, intentional infliction of suffering. I had been considering these options when an unexpected phone call changed everything. Mrs. Miller, this is Detective Sarah Williams with the Portland Police Bureau. I'm calling about Patricia Thompson. We've received complaints from several families about her estate sale business, and your name came up as someone who might have information about her business practices. It turned out that Patricia's luck had finally run out. 2 other families had come forward with stories similar to mine, elderly relatives who had hired Patricia to help manage estate sales, only to discover later that she had vastly undervalued items and kept substantial portions of the proceeds for herself. The police were building a case for fraud and elder abuse, and they wanted my cooperation as a witness. The thing is, Detective Williams explained, most of these families don't have the documentation you have. Your grandmother's trust papers and the detailed records you've compiled make your case much stronger than the others. Your testimony could be crucial in getting convictions that protect other families from going through what you experienced. That conversation forced me to confront a decision I'd been avoiding. I could continue trying to rebuild my life as if Patricia's theft had been an isolated incident, accepting Mike's desire to minimize family conflict and move forward. Or I could acknowledge that what had happened to me was part of a larger pattern that would continue unless someone stood up to stop it. Mike was not supportive of my decision to cooperate with the police investigation. You got most of your stuff back, he argued during one of our increasingly frequent disagreements about how to handle the situation. Mom paid the restitution. Why do we need to drag this through the courts and create more drama? Because it's not just about us, Mike. Your mother has been stealing from vulnerable families for years. She targeted us because she thought we wouldn't fight back, and she's probably doing the same thing to other families right now. But she's learned her lesson. She knows she can't get away with this kind of thing anymore. I stared at him, in disbelief. Her lesson is that she shouldn't target people who have legal protections. That's not the same as learning not to steal from families in crisis. The fundamental disconnect between us had become impossible to ignore. Mike saw Patricia's behavior as a family problem that should be handled privately to preserve relationships and avoid public embarrassment. I saw it as criminal behavior that deserved legal consequences to prevent future victims. Our marriage counseling sessions became exercises in futility, with Mike repeatedly asking me to let go of my anger and focus on rebuilding, while I tried to explain that justice and accountability weren't the same thing as vengeance or holding grudges. Jessica, our counselor said during one particularly frustrating session, you seem to have very strong feelings about the importance of legal consequences for Patricia's actions. Can you help Mike understand why this matters so much to you? Because someone has to stand up to bullies, I said, frustrated that this wasn't obvious. Because letting someone get away with harmful behavior just teaches them that they can do it again to someone else. Because the families Patricia victimized in the past deserved someone to fight for them, and the families she might target in the future deserve protection. Mike shook his head. But at what cost, Jess? At the cost Of our marriage? Our family relationships? Our peace of mind? At the cost of looking the other way when someone does something wrong, I replied. I can't live with that. The criminal trial began 6 months after my discharge from the hospital. Patricia had been charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and elder abuse based on evidence from 5 different families, including mine. Her defense attorney tried to portray her as a well-meaning woman who had made some poor business decisions. But the prosecution had assembled a compelling case showing a pattern of deliberate deception and exploitation. Testifying against Patricia was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Not because I doubted the rightness of my decision, but because of what it meant for my relationship with Mike. He sat in the courtroom gallery, his face carefully neutral, while I detailed how his mother had systematically stolen from us while I was unconscious and vulnerable. Patricia's sentencing hearing brought a kind of closure I hadn't expected. The judge, an older woman who had clearly been moved by the testimony about Patricia's targeting of elderly and vulnerable families, gave her the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement, 3 years in prison and 5 years of probation, plus restitution to all victims. Mrs. Thompson, the judge said before pronouncing sentence, you exploited the trust of families during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. You turned their grief and medical crises into opportunities for personal profit. The court finds your actions particularly reprehensible because they involved calculated deception rather than desperate circumstances. As Patricia was led away in handcuffs, I felt not triumph, but a deep sadness for all the families she had hurt, and for the family relationships that had been destroyed by her actions. Mike and I drove home from the courthouse in silence. When we reached our house, our restored, partially refurnished, forever changed house, he finally spoke. I hope you're satisfied, he said, his voice heavy with resignation and something that might have been grief. I'm satisfied that she can't hurt other families the way she hurt us, I replied. Whether that makes you happy or not isn't really the point. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that something fundamental had broken between us. Not just trust, but our entire understanding of what marriage meant, what loyalty required, and how to handle conflicts between personal relationships and moral principles. 3 months later, Mike moved out. Not because either of us was angry anymore, but because we had both realized that we wanted fundamentally different things from life and from relationships. He wanted peace and family harmony above all else. I wanted integrity and accountability, even when they came at considerable personal cost. Our divorce was quiet and efficient, handled through mediation rather than courtroom drama. Mike kept his share of our joint assets, and I kept the house and everything my grandmother had left me. We divided our possessions with the careful courtesy of strangers, which in many ways we had become. I didn't remarry or start dating seriously for several years after that. The experience with Patricia had taught me to be more careful about trust, more alert to signs of manipulation and control. But it had also taught me that I was stronger than I had realized, that I could stand up for myself and others even when it meant standing alone. The house on Hawthorne Street became fully mine in ways it had never been during my marriage. I restored it gradually, thoughtfully, mixing recovered family pieces with new items I chose carefully for their beauty, their function, and their meaning to me. I started hosting dinner parties again, filling the dining room with friends and colleagues who appreciated the history and warmth of the space. I also began volunteering with organizations that helped families navigate estate sales and end-of-life financial transitions, sharing my expertise as a financial advisor to help protect people from the kind of exploitation I had experienced. The work was satisfying in ways my regular client practice had never been, helping vulnerable people avoid becoming victims, teaching them to ask the right questions and demand proper documentation. Sometimes people would ask if I regretted pursuing criminal charges against Patricia, if I thought the family disruption and divorce had been worth the satisfaction of seeing justice done. The question always puzzled me, as if justice were some kind of luxury rather than a necessity. as if protecting other families from harm were a matter of personal preference rather than moral obligation. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from one of the other families Patricia had victimized. An elderly couple whose daughter had hired Patricia to help liquidate their possessions after the father suffered a stroke. The letter thanked me for having the courage to testify, explaining that the restitution payments had allowed them to recover some heirlooms they thought were lost forever. "We kept thinking someone should do something about that woman," the letter read, "but we were too old and tired and hurt to fight. Thank you for being the someone who did something." That letter sits framed in my home office now, next to a photograph of my grandmother and me taken in the garden behind this house when I was 12 years old. Both reminders of different kinds of inheritance, the tangible legacy of family possessions and property, and the intangible legacy of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. My grandmother had left me more than just furniture, and jewelry and legal protections. She had left me an example of how to live with integrity, how to make choices based on values rather than convenience, and how to create a life that honored both the past and the future. The house on Hawthorne Street is fuller now than it was during my marriage, filled with friends who choose to be here, with meaningful possessions acquired deliberately rather than inherited accidentally, and with a sense of peace that comes from knowing I am exactly where and who I'm supposed to be. Sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, I sit on the front porch with my coffee, made in a vintage percolator I found at an estate sale run by honest, licensed professionals, and think about all the ways my life has changed since that terrible October evening when a drunk driver altered my path forever. The accident that could have killed me instead revealed truths about my marriage and my family that I needed to see. Patricia's theft, while devastating, ultimately taught me about my own strength and the importance of fighting for justice, even when it comes at personal cost. I am not the same woman who left for that client meeting 5 years ago, trusting that her life would continue unchanged in her absence. I am someone harder, perhaps, but also more authentic. Someone who knows the difference between keeping peace and enabling harm, between forgiveness and accountability, between family loyalty and moral courage. The story people tell about my experience usually focuses on the dramatic revelation about the mortgage, the moment when I held all the power and Patricia realized she had been outmaneuvered by a woman she had underestimated. But the real story, the one that matters most to me, is about discovering who I was when everything familiar had been stripped away, when I had to choose between easy peace and difficult justice, when I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be when no one was watching except my own conscience. My grandmother's house still holds its secrets and stories, still connects me to generations of strong women who faced their own challenges and made their own difficult choices. But now, it also holds my story, my choices, my commitment to living a life worthy of the legacy I inherited, and the legacy I hope to leave. The trust documents sit in my safe, protecting future generations from the kind of exploitation I survived. The recovered heirlooms fill my rooms with beauty and memory, and somewhere in Portland, families sleep safely knowing that a woman who preyed on their vulnerability has been held accountable for her crimes. That is inheritance enough for anyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.